For my biographical project, I wanted to introduce you to somebody that I became familiar with 23 years ago. Prior to that time, I'd never heard of this person at all, but in a church history course that I had with Dr. Ken Davis, who we've already referenced in this course, who is a specialist on Anabaptists, I also became familiar with a work which is a giant compilation of the stories of Anabaptists that were martyred for their convictions and their persuasion during the Reformation. The Anabaptists were an interesting bunch, often considered as the Radical Reformation. They were often persecuted from both sides of the Reformation. And the person in particular that I want to speak of is a young girl by the name of Janneken van Munstdorp. She challenges me every day, and we'll get into some of the reasons why in a little bit. But just as an introduction to the person of Janneken, she was originally born in the town of Lepper in Flanders of Belgium. You would know that better by its more modern name, which is Ypres, the town of the fame from World War I. And although she was born there, we don't know a whole lot about her. And the next time we see her, she's actually in Antwerp, and she's married to her husband Hans as well. To give you a bit of an idea of the context then of Antwerp, it's interesting for us to read some of the things that are written about that particular city at the time, because persecution there was tremendous. In a letter of the 29th of February 1568, the Duke of Alva described Antwerp as a Babylon, confusion and receptacle of all sects, indifferently, and as the town most frequented by pernicious people. In this hostile judgment that he's giving shows that non-Catholic religious movements such as Calvinism, Lutheranism, and Anabaptism were thriving in the town of Antwerp at this time. And that's what gave rise to oppression. Initially, the town of Antwerp received the Reformation, and then we saw all this move towards different groups that are coming in, also some of the dynamics that took place within the Reformation elsewhere, and different radical movements that took place, meant that Antwerp began to vacillate back and forth between both sides. And according to what's written here, and according to a book by Guido Marnef, also it indicates that that is what brought about persecution of the Christians. And so not just the Anabaptists, the Calvinists were persecuted as well, but in particular, I wanted to take a look at the Anabaptists and Janneken. In his famous book Van Brock on the Martyr's Mirror that I've referenced before, he says this: "The awful murderer's den of the city of Antwerp, though full of stakes and slain bodies." You need to understand, Antwerp was probably, of all the cities in Belgium at least, was the most prominent for the martyrdom of believers within the Reformation. And so full of stakes and slain bodies, and the ashes of the saints was at this time not yet sated with the many massacres that were perpetrated for the sake of the true faith and of the innocent sheep of Christ. This appeared also the case of 5 pious Christians, namely Hans van Munstdorp and Janneken Munstdorp, his wife. That's the Janneken that we've spoken of already. And at the same time, we also noticed that there was American, Aliskin, and Macon who were also arrested with him at the time. These were about the year 1573, while they were gathered to hear the word of God, apprehended together, and confined in the prison at Antwerp. Now, again, further on with Antwerp, something that's worth knowing, that Morillon estimated the number of Mennonites were in 1566 in the town of Antwerp were 2,000, and many of them suffered a martyr's death. Very often torture was applied. In 1559, 15 Mennonites were in prison at the same time. In 1569, again, a great number were taken to prison when a service at Jan Poot's house was surprised. And Aleideken sings about no fewer than 72 martyrs put to death between 1550 and 1560. You see, Antwerp was an incredibly dangerous place for Anabaptists, and in 1573 we see a renewed persecution of them at that time. In 1573, it says the congregation which was meeting in the house of Jan de Cordis was overtaken and 35 persons imprisoned, 28 of whom were executed. And if you take a look at Charlie Crabill's Guide to the Anabaptist Martyrs of Europe, 1524 to 1614, even just taking a quick review of the number of names that are there, from about 1535 to 1573, you see in Antwerp alone over 200 Anabaptists are martyred, mostly burned at the stake, some drowned, any number of different ways. And in the year of 1573, just even up to, not the entire year, but up to the point of Janneken's martyrdom, there are 28 martyred that year alone, and one of those including her husband. And so the story goes that Janneken and her husband Hans and several others are at a meeting together, at which point in time there's the knock on the door and they are apprehended and they're taken into custody. There's some discrepancy on the dates for her husband. According to the Martyr's Mirror, he's taken out in September, yet according to the guide to the Anabaptist martyrs, we see that it says that he's actually, he isn't executed until the winter. But what happens is they're taken out in 1573 is when they're apprehended, but they find out that Janneken is pregnant. And so rather than the bunch of them all being then executed together, they take Hans out in Prior and they execute him, and they're going to keep Janneken alive along with the others as attendants to her until the time that the baby is to be born. And then once the baby is born, then she too will face the fulfillment of her sentence. It's during this time in prison that the reason why we have so much good material on Janneken, as I said, we have little on Hans, we have little on Janneken up to this point. But during this time in prison, Janneken takes the opportunity to write 3 powerful, powerful letters. The first of these letters that I want to address, it's not the first one that she actually writes, it's the second one, but it's the first one that I want to address, is the one that she writes to her parents. Because we begin to understand something of the heart of this young girl. She begins this letter to her parents: "My dear father and my dear mother, I wish you a true understanding and a contrite spirit in your hearts to fear God for an affectionate greeting." And what we become aware of is that her parents are not believers or true believers. We don't know what their state was, whether they were involved in some form of church. But from her perspective is that her parents are not truly following after Christ. And this is her first concern in her letter to her parents, is their heart. She writes this a little later on: "It would be a great joy to me if you should yet come to fear the Lord. Oh, that you might yet at the last hour work in the Lord's vineyard. Though you seem to be free and are not imprisoned, you are not certain of a single hour as to how long you will live." And here is this woman who's facing, this young girl who's facing certain death, execution, that she's already seen happen to her own husband, that has already happened, 28 some odd times in Antwerp, and her primary concern is not for her own life. As a matter of fact, later on she says this: "If I did not want to be saved, I would seek an easy life as gladly as others. For he that would fear God must expect these things: tribulation, suffering, bonds, and imprisonment, and we can nowhere have a free place, for it is given unto us not only to believe in God, but also to suffer for his name." And so here she is, writing to her parents, not appealing for her release. At any time, she can be freed from this imprisonment if she were only to recant and walk away. Yet her primary concern is this: that her parents come to know Christ, and that her life live as a testimony despite the persecution. That's her care. That's her concern as she writes her parents. That letter then moves on to ask that they would do something to help her sister who has served her well, that they would continue to visit, and that she's the child at 1 month has been sent off with friends of hers to be cared for. But she asked that the family not forget the daughter, that they would visit her and they would care for her. And yet her primary desire in the midst of all this is still that she be faithful to God at the cost of her life, and counting it as something that she is unworthy for. And so letter 1 to her parents challenges me to bits. Furthermore, I can't help but be struck by how counter this is to what we so often put forward as the rightful place for the follower of Jesus Christ in this world. That we're so often putting forward that it is our following Christ that ought to provide us comfort, that's we ought to be able to escape the difficulties of this world. And yet her fervor, her desire for the Lord is so strong that it is undeterred by the fact that she is not receiving any of the things that we would so often make conditional in our own lives. The second letter that I want to address is actually her third. It's the one that she writes to her sister and siblings, and it's written on what would seem to be the eve of her execution. It says that it's written at 1 in the night, but it's not clear. I don't think that would be 1 in the afternoon, so it's 1 o'clock in the morning on the 5th, the day before she's actually executed. She's executed on October 6th of 1573, and she's writing to her sister, and again she's speaking about the abundant and unspeakable grace of the Father and the mercy of God and the loving kindness of the Father and the Son. And she begins to challenge her sister, putting things in perspective again, and how she challenged her inquisitors as they went after her, and she challenged them in return. And it shares how she's preaching to those, not again trying to escape the difficulties, but putting things in an eternal perspective, and explaining why it is that she will persist in following God, and explains to her sister how God continually is giving her the grace to deal with this. And the courage that we see in her is phenomenal. She goes on to say, "For I expect no joy in this world because of my dear husband who went this way before me, and whom by the grace of the Lord I am now to follow. Having long waited for this time, I also go before you." And she says this to her sister. She doesn't say, run for your life. She says this, "Follow me." I can't help but think of Paul, who says, "Imitate me." And here's Janneken to her sister. And with such an eternal perspective, she's saying, "Follow me. The time of travail is now at hand. Weeping and mourning shall then be over. Oh, what a joy this is in my heart, so that I cannot describe it to you. Oh, how mightily the Lord works in us, poor, weak vessels. For I know that I have never merited it from the Lord, but am worthy of nothing but eternal death. If the Lord would enter into the judgment with me, I should in no wise be saved. But now I must expect salvation out of pure grace." She goes on to encourage her sisters, and again, she's not saying, "Please get me out of this," somebody, moving that way, but she's spending her time and energy setting a good example and challenging her. She says, "But my dear sister, it is now my turn. It may very soon, perhaps tomorrow, be your turn. Be of good courage and patiently abide your time, my dearest sister." She speaks again how she continued to read her sister's letters, and she encourages her brother to serve her sister, and sister to brother, and them to continue to move along and encourage them. But she says, "My dear chosen brethren and dear sisters, weary not of Jesus Christ. I hope to go before you yet to the heavenly city to wait for you under the altar with all the chosen saints. Follow me." And there's her reference to Revelation, as the martyrs are below the altar in the book of Revelation, awaiting for the fulfillment of time to take place. "I must now go before you where I shall enjoy bliss. Adieu, sister dear. Remember me still. The time of travail is at hand." And again, here, this young girl with no position, no official capacity, not a clergy position. She is a young wife, but the strength of her character, the significance of her convictions, and just her strength in the Lord challenges me. But yet, the last letter I want to approach even more so. The third letter that I want to deal with, and it was actually the first that she wrote, is quite frankly one that has haunted me for years. Because what haunts me is this question: would I do the same? Could I do the same? I can honestly say I aspire to be like this woman because of what she writes. In this one, in August of AD 1573, she writes a letter to her 1-month-old child that has been scuttled off with friends so that the authorities would not have her. She's leaving this child behind of all the temptations of motherhood for her to revoke or recant her position, to turn away and chase the child. But she persists, and she writes to the child, "My dear little child, I commend you to the Almighty, great and terrible God, who is wise, that he will keep you and let you grow up in his fear, or that he will take you home in your youth. This is my heart's request of the Lord. You who are yet so young, and whom I must leave here in this wicked, evil, perverse world. Again, she says, I will commend you to the Lord. Let him do with you according to his will. And as the letter begins to play out, and she's just lavishing on her child, but she's not saying flee and run away. She's explaining to the child the convictions of both the child, that the child's being orphaned by these parents, but because of the parents' conviction in the Lord. She says, here I lie expecting death. Every morning shall now soon follow your dear father, and I, your dear mother, write to you, my dearest child. She says, remember us. Don't be ashamed of us. Know what we stood for and what we are all about. She says, I must now also forsake all this for the Lord's sake, which the world is not worthy to suffer. The Lord has chosen us hereunto. She sees this position as a chosen the path that God has laid out before her. She says, I leave you this, that you will fulfill my request, always uniting with them that fear God. And she challenges the child to read this. She challenges her friends to read it to the child. And there's multiple pages here, and I really can't go into all of it as much as I wish I could. But what really has always struck me all these years is that as she moves towards the conclusion of the chapter, she begins to say these things too. I leave you here among my friends. I hope that my father and my stepmother and my brothers and my sister will do the best with you as long as they live. Be subject and obedient to them in everything so far as not contrary to God. And she's giving all this motherly challenges to the child on how to behave. And she says, and now, Janneken, my dear lamb, who are yet very little and young, I leave this letter together with a gold reel, a memento, a token that she gives with her to her. She says, follow me and your father, and be not ashamed to confess us before the world, for we are not ashamed to confess our faith before the world in this adulterous generation. And you read that and you think she's challenging her to follow in the faith, but more so, she's challenging Janneken not just to follow her in the faith, but in the consequences of the faith. She says, let it be your glory that we did not die for any evil doing, and strive to do likewise, though they should also seek to kill you. And on no account cease to love God above all, for no one can prevent you from fearing God. If you follow that which is good and seek peace and ensue it, you shall receive the crown of eternal life. This crown I wish you, and the crucified, bleeding, naked, despised, rejected, and slain Jesus Christ for your bridegroom. And she challenges her 1-month-old child to live a life that should lead to that child's death if need be, but in service and faithfulness to God and to Jesus Christ. She says, you follow after us if that's what it takes. And ever since I've encountered this story in Janneken van Munstdorp, I've asked myself this, can I do the same? Do I have that kind of conviction as to the preeminence of Jesus Christ? I mean, we see through her letters a love of Scripture. We see through her letters an eternal perspective. We see through her letters embracing the suffering of Christ and a willingness to do the same, an unshakable faith. We see a willingness to sacrifice anything and everything, and to think of others before thinking of herself, that her parents coming to Christ is more important than her own physical salvation, that her sister's own walk and faithfulness is more important than anything else, and even to her own child. It's a huge challenge. That's why I wanted to share with you why it is, or share with you my passion and the ministry to my heart that this woman had and has had to many through the years.